questions that could hopefully would lead us to understand this text a little better. And I just titled this, Tell Me More About This. Tell me more about this. God opens up in this 7th chapter by saying, I have made you like a god to Pharaoh. I have made you like a god to Pharaoh. And he's speaking to Moses, and he says that, listen, I'm going to make Aaron like your prophet. In the Hebrew, in the original writing, the Hebrew, the word like is not in there. Actually, he says, I have made you a god to Pharaoh. I have made you a god to Pharaoh. But translation turns this to, I have made you like a god to Pharaoh. And I really wrestled with that in the beginning, not in a negative sense, but really trying to understand, God, why would you tell Moses, a human being? And I'm reading this from the New International Version, and it uses the capital G. And you know, when we were taught, the capital G speaks of God. And so yet God is telling Moses that I have made you like a god in the eyes of Pharaoh. Bruce J. Molina, who is a biblical scholar, he talks about the honor system of the ancient days. That honor took on a very different meaning than what it may have today. People during those ancient times, they really lived by honor. That honor was a social status that they really fought for and would really stone people for if it was ever put in jeopardy. And so oftentimes what Bruce J. Molina argues is that whenever there was someone of a higher status being questioned by someone of a lower status, that the person of the higher status would normally not respond. Because if the person of the higher status responded to the person of the lower status, you did one or two things. You either brought that person up to your level or you lowered yourself down to that level. And he argues, he supports this argument with the text that we use all the time about Jesus when the woman came who was caught in the act of sin and he knelt down. And I know there have been many things assuming what Jesus said, but what Molina would argue is that, listen, Jesus did not respond to them, first of all, because he knew that it was a trick question. Second of all, he did not respond because if he responded, then he would have lowered himself to their level, or he would have elevated them to theirs. There's another parable in the Bible about the king and the banquet, that after he sent the invitation out and people didn't come, and then finally he said, send it out into the streets, send it out to all the people. And these were people who normally would not have been invited to a banquet, but he said, send it out to them. And then once the people came in, there was a guest. There was a guest who was there. And when he asked him, why was he not dressed? And the guest, usually in that day, whenever they had these gatherings, they would invite this guest who would be considered a more popular, higher status person. And so in this parable, which we know parables they were messages, they didn't actually happen, but in this parable, this guest refused to respond to the king as to why he was not dressed. And then before the parable is over, he says that he cast him out. And this supports that idea that, listen, that in a society, your status meant something. So now what does all of this mean for this text with Moses? Because God tells Moses in the text that, listen, when Pharaoh asked you to show a sign, because God knew that Pharaoh was going to challenge who Moses is, because Pharaoh would have done himself a disjustice to challenge someone of a low status. Even though Moses was raised in his home, Pharaoh was looked at as human deity. And so God is saying to him, listen, I have now placed you in position that you can stand with the most powerful force in Egypt, because I have made you a god in his eyes. And so now Moses is able to stand with Pharaoh. He's able to battle with Pharaoh, not because of necessarily who Moses is, but because of who is in Moses and who is working through Moses. So why do we have these plagues in the first place? Well, when we look at these plagues did a couple things. They sent a message to both Moses, to Pharaoh, and not just those two, but even to the people, that God is a sovereign God, that God is an all-powerful God, that God is, listen, in charge of everything. So when he sends these first two plagues, one is the snake. And so we have to ask ourselves, why a snake? Why not any other animal? And why the staff? Well, the staff represented authority. Here God sends Moses down into Pharaoh's empire, sends Moses down into Pharaoh's kingdom with the staff. And he tells him to take the symbol of authority. Oh, how life would be if we just took the symbol of authority that God gave us, and that's just simply, listen, in the name of Jesus. But he takes the symbol of authority, which is this staff, and he throws it down on the ground, and then it is transformed into this creature that we call a snake. It is transformed into this creature that God has control over the creature, and this creature has control over the creatures that Pharaoh magicians created. The snake represented the destruction and the hand of God that was getting ready to take place in Egypt. The snake represented God's power at work on behalf of an oppressed people to bring his strength and power against Pharaoh. And also then there's the blood. Why? Why the blood? Well, the blood represents death in this case, or at least the blood in the Nile being turned into blood represents death. And we'll get into that just a little later, but it is very important because oftentimes when I would just speak for me, when I would read these, I would just kind of look, okay, well, that was a snake, and then he turned the Nile. So basically what he was doing was showing Pharaoh his power. This is true, but there's meaning behind all of this. It's not just there for us to read. It's not just there for us to look at. And so what we have here, and I'm going to try this again because I want to make sure that that we're on the same page. And I think there's a sheet that I may have left off, but we're going to go through with it anyway. But how do we apply this to life? The first thing is that we have to understand that we must know who and what God made us to be. We must know that. See, there's a reason why Moses had to understand that, listen, God had made him like a god before Pharaoh. Because if Moses was not sure of who he was, if you're not sure as to who you are in God, then you'll find yourself being intimidated by life's challenges. God has not given us a spirit of fear. And so therefore, when we don't know who we are in God, we really don't know what type of power we're working with. God has to let Moses know that you are not some inferior being in the presence of Pharaoh. And God has sent me to remind those of you who are watching today that, listen, you're not inferior to any force that comes against you. No problem, no sickness, no financial struggles, anything that you are going through in your life, you have to remind yourself that God has made me greater than any problem that I could ever face in life. But it's when we don't understand this that we bow down to the challenges of life. It's when we don't understand this that we allow people to walk over us. We allow circumstances to beat us down until we're depleted of any strength, of any spirit, of any fire, of any power. But when you know who your God is, and when you know who you are in the Lord, you will find yourself understanding that no weapon formed against me shall prosper. We have to know that God did not make us these timid, individuals that at the first sign of trouble we're ready to run and tuck our tails in and throw in the flags or throw in the white cloth or whatever it is that we do when we don't feel that we have the strength to deal with something. But when we understand that God is with us, when we understand that God is on our side, when we understand that God is in the midst of our trouble with us, then there's no need for us to have long-term fear. And I say long-term fear because I may be a little different from others, is that fear is a natural reaction. That there are going to be things that will come in our lives that will bring fear. But fear should just be something that checks in and check out. Because when we know that God is with us and then we pour from that strength that God has given to us, then we take on our challenges and we face them head on. Not only should we understand that we should not be intimidated by any force, we must also understand who our God is. So this takes us back to the snake. Because here God challenges Moses on Moses' ground. Now, I was never athletic, but one thing I did know is that whenever there was an athletic event, whether it was football or basketball, that you always had this thing called the home court advantage. And so here God is in Egypt, that in one sense we may say that is on Pharaoh's home court, but we understand that God owns everything, that the cattle on 1,000 hills belong to him. But here God steps into Pharaoh's empire, takes the staff that represents authority, has Aaron to lay it on the ground, and it turns into this creature, a snake, and it destroys. You see, I guess where I'm going with this is, look, it doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter your location, because sometimes we find ourselves out of our comfort zone. Sometimes we find ourselves in a different place with God. As I stated once before, it's one thing to trust God when all your bills are paid. It's one thing to have faith when your car note is not only on time, but before time, your mortgage, everything is in order, your health is doing well. But when you are walking with God, when you're behind on bills, and when you don't know how you're going to make it, when you hold your checkbook in one hand and your bills in the other, and your bills outweigh your checkbook, and you are having to trust God through this. But God wants us to understand that no matter where you are, no matter what your position is in life, no matter what you're going through, no matter what sickness you're dealing with, that God is still the ultimate authority of life. And not only does God have authority over you, not only does God have authority over me, but he has authority over any weapon that comes against you. God has authority over your enemies. God has authority over sickness. God has authority over anything that may come up in your life. So when you know who you are and when you know who your God is, you ought to walk in faith and walk with that determination that I'll get through this. Finally, we have to be prepared to grasp, or at least hold on to, the newness or the new thing or the new things that God is getting ready to do in your life. I didn't read all of chapter 7, but later on in here you'll find that when God put the blood in the Nile, that when he turned the Nile into blood, that everything in it represented God's ability to destroy whatever gets in his way, whatever gets in the way of God's people. The significance of the Nile turning into the blood was that the Nile River was a channel of death for the Egyptians. They would use the Nile to not only destroy others, like they did with the Israelites when they said take all the firstborn sons and throw them into the Nile, but it was also a way of keeping the people loyal. So look at what God does. God takes the very river that Pharaoh used to try to destroy his people, and he cuts off their life source. Because in a land like this, water was key. You had to have water, and it was like first priority to maintain the water. So now here God turns the river into blood. And everything that was in the river, the fish, they all died. And the stench, they could not take it. And the other pieces, I think it's chapter 5, verse 21, where the Egyptian told Moses that, listen, these Hebrews, they have become